Have you ever wondered what keeps certain places open all night? What lurks in the shadows of those fluorescent lit sanctuaries we call convenience stores? Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the rules that keep us alive at Maple Hollow General Store in Vermont. My name is Sarah Chun, and I've been working the night shift at Maple Hollow General Store for exactly 3 months now. When I first applied for this job, I thought the worst thing I'd have to deal with would be drunk college students buying energy drinks and gas station hot dogs at 2 in the morning. I was wrong. So very, very wrong. Maple Hollow is one of those tiny Vermont towns that appears on no tourist maps. Nestled deep in the Green Mountains where the cell phone towers don't reach and the nearest neighbor might be miles away. The general store sits at the intersection of Route 108 and an unnamed dirt road, surrounded by dense pine forests that seem to swallow sound itself. During the day, it's a charming little establishment where locals buy their morning coffee and exchange gossip. But when the sun sets behind those towering mountains, everything changes. I should have known something was off during my first interview. Mrs. Abernathy, the owner, was a rail-thin woman in her 70s with cloudy blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. She hired me on the spot, which should have been my first red flag. Good-paying night shift jobs don't just fall into your lap, especially not in towns where the population barely breaks 300. There are rules, she told me as she handed me a laminated sheet of paper. Follow them exactly, and you'll do just fine. Break them, and she trailed off, her weathered fingers drumming against the counter. Well, let's just say we've had to replace several night shift workers over the years. The rules seemed simple enough at first glance. No customers after midnight. Keep the radio on station 97.3 at all times. Never turn off the fluorescent lights in the back storage room. Don't look directly at the security cameras between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m. Check the freezer temperature every hour, and if it drops below 0 degrees, leave the store immediately. I laughed it off initially, thinking it was just small-town eccentricity. Maybe Mrs. Abernathy was getting senile, or perhaps it was some elaborate prank to mess with a new employee. I was fresh out of college, drowning in student debt, and this job paid twice what I could make anywhere else in the area. I needed the money, and I convinced myself that following a few harmless rules was a small price to pay. My first night started normally enough. I arrived at 10 p.m. to relieve Jenny, the evening shift worker. She was packing up her things with unusual haste, barely making eye contact as she rattled off the basic procedures. Count the register, stock the cigarette display, clean the coffee machines. Standard convenience store duties. Remember the rules, she said as she headed for the door. All of them. Every single one. Yeah, sure. I replied, still not taking it seriously. Have a good night. She paused at the threshold, her hand on the door handle. Sarah, I mean it. The rules aren't suggestions. They're survival instructions. And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the harsh fluorescent glow of the store. The building felt different at night, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The familiar hum of refrigerators and the occasional crackle from the ancient radio on station 97.3 became the soundtrack to my isolation. For the first few hours, nothing unusual happened. A few late-night customers trickled in, a trucker buying coffee and beef jerky, a young mother picking up baby formula, an elderly man who purchased a single lottery ticket and left without a word. Normal people doing normal things. I began to relax, thinking that maybe this job wouldn't be so bad after all. But as the clock approached midnight, something shifted. The temperature in the store seemed to drop several degrees. and the radio began emitting a low static that made my skin crawl. I checked the thermostat, but it read the same as before. The last customer, a nervous-looking teenager buying energy drinks, kept glancing over his shoulder as if something was watching him from the shadows between the aisles. "You should go," I told him as the clock struck 11:58. "We're closing soon." He nodded frantically and practically threw his money on the counter before bolting for the exit. I locked the door behind him, just as the rules instructed, and that's when the real strangeness began. At exactly midnight, the radio switched stations on its own. Instead of the classic rock that had been playing all evening, a woman's voice emerged from the speakers, soft, melodic, and utterly chilling. She was singing a lullaby in a language it didn't recognize, the words flowing like cold honey over broken glass. I reached for the radio dial, intending to change it back to 97.3, but something stopped me. The rules said to keep it on that station at all times, but what if the station changed itself? I decided to leave it alone and focus on my other duties. The freezer temperature check was due at 1 a.m., so I busied myself with restocking shelves and cleaning counters. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes, I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting between aisles, a shape pressed against the front windows, but when I turned to look directly, nothing was there. The security monitors mounted behind the counter showed 6 different angles of the store and parking lot. Everything appeared normal on the screens, but I found myself avoiding looking at them as 2 a.m. approached. The rule about not looking directly at the cameras between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m. seemed absurd, but after the radio incident, I wasn't taking any chances. At 12:45 a.m., I heard footsteps in the back storage room. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to circle the perimeter of the space. I grabbed a flashlight from behind the counter and approached the doorway that led to the back area. The fluorescent lights were still on, just as the rules required, casting harsh shadows between the towering shelves of inventory. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone back there?" The footsteps stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it felt oppressive. I stood there for several long minutes, straining my ears for any sound, but heard nothing except the distant static from the radio and the hum of the refrigeration units. When I returned to the front counter, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Wet footprints led from the back storage room to the front door, footprints that definitely hadn't been there before. They were small, like those of a child, and they seemed to glisten under the harsh store lighting, as if they were still drying. I followed the trail with my eyes, noting how the prints became progressively fainter as they approached the entrance. But what really terrified me was that the footprints only went one way. There were no prints leading into the store, only ones leading out, as if something had materialized in the back room and walked to the front door before simply vanishing. My hand shook as I checked my watch. 12:58 a.m. The freezer temperature check was due in 2 minutes, and I dreaded the thought of walking to the back of the store again. But the rules were clear, and Jenny's warning echoed in my mind. Their survival instructions. I forced myself to move, walking slowly down the center aisle toward the large freezer unit at the rear of the store. Each step felt like walking deeper into a nightmare, and I had to resist the urge to run back to the relative safety of the front counter. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting dancing shadows that seemed to reach for me with grasping fingers. The freezer temperature gauge read exactly 0 degrees. Not below 0, which would have meant I could leave, but exactly at the threshold. I stared at the needle, willing it to drop just 1 degree lower so I could escape this place, but it remained stubbornly fixed at 0. As I stood there, debating whether 0 degrees counted as below 0, I heard a sound that stopped my heart, the soft thud of something heavy hitting the freezer door from the inside. Then another thud, and another. Something was in the freezer, trying to get out. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a display of crackers in my haste to get away. The thudding continued, growing more insistent, and I swear I could hear muffled voices calling from within the freezer unit. Multiple voices, all speaking at once, creating a cacophony of desperation that seemed to seep through the heavy metal door. That's when I noticed the security cameras. Even though I was trying not to look directly at them, I could see in my peripheral vision that the screens were showing something impossible. The camera trained on the freezer area showed me standing there, just as expected, but it also showed figures that weren't visible to my naked eye. Tall, gaunt shapes stood in the aisles around me, their faces obscured by shadow, but their intentions clearly malevolent. They were reaching toward me with impossibly long arms, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by a drunk puppeteer. I ran back to the front counter, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. The radio had gone silent, the sudden absence of the haunting lullaby, somehow more terrifying than the music itself. In the silence, I could hear my own ragged breathing and the electric hum of the store's lighting. But underneath it all was something else, a low, rhythmic scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across concrete. The sound was coming from above me. I looked up at the dropped ceiling tiles, and my breath caught in my throat. One of the tiles was slowly shifting, as if something heavy was moving around in the space above. Dust and small debris rained down onto the counter as whatever was up there continued its restless pacing. The scratching sound grew louder, more frantic, and I realized with growing horror that it was directly above my head. The clock read 2:15 a.m. I had 45 more minutes before I could look at the security cameras again, 6.5 more hours before my shift ended, and no way to contact the outside world even if I wanted to. My cell phone showed no signal, just as I'd expected, and the store's landline had been disconnected years ago, according to Mrs. Abernathy. I was completely and utterly alone with whatever was sharing this space with me. As if sensing my realization, the scratching above me stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been, pregnant with menace and the promise of something terrible about to happen. I gripped the edge of the counter so tightly my knuckles went white, every muscle in my body coiled and ready to run, though I had nowhere to go. That's when I heard the whisper. It came from directly behind me, so close I could feel breath on the back of my neck. A single word, spoken in a voice like rustling leaves. "Sarah." I spun around, but nothing was there except empty aisles and the glow of the fluorescent lights. Yet somehow, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever had spoken my name was still there, just beyond my ability to see it. Watching, waiting, and I still had over 6 hours left on my shift. The minutes crawled by like wounded animals. I stood frozen behind the counter, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid that any sound I made might invite whatever was lurking in the shadows to reveal itself fully. The whisper of my name still echoed in my ears, and I found myself questioning whether I had actually heard it or if my terrified mind was playing tricks on me. At 2:30 a.m., the radio crackled back to life. This time, Instead of the haunting lullaby, a man's voice emerged from the speakers. He was reading what sounded like a news report, but the words made no sense. Something about missing persons from decades past, about a fire that had consumed half the town in 1987, about children who had wandered into the woods and never returned. The strangest part was that he kept mentioning Maple Hollow General Store as the last place these people had been seen. I grabbed a piece of paper and started writing down what he was saying, my pen shaking so badly I could barely form legible letters. According to the broadcast, 17 people had vanished from this exact location over the past 35 years. The victims ranged in age from 7 to 63, with no apparent pattern except for one chilling detail. They had all disappeared during the overnight hours between midnight and dawn. The broadcast ended abruptly at 2:45 a.m., cutting to static before returning to the same classic rock station that had been playing earlier. But now the familiar songs sounded distorted, as if they were being played underwater or from a great distance. I reached for the volume knob, hoping to make the music clearer, but the moment my fingers touched the radio, it went completely silent. In that silence, I heard something that made my soul freeze. The soft jingle of the bell above the front door. I spun toward the entrance, my heart hammering, but the door was still locked, the deadbolt firmly in place. Yet the bell continued to chime gently, as if moved by a breeze that didn't exist. As I watched in growing horror, the door handle began to turn slowly, deliberately, even though there was clearly no one on the other side of the glass. The handle turned completely, and the door pushed open just a few inches before stopping. Cold air rushed into the store, carrying with it the scent of pine needles and something else, something rotten and sweet, like flowers left too long in a grave. The bell chimed once more and then fell silent, leaving the door standing slightly ajar. I knew I should close it. Every instinct screamed at me to run over and slam it shut, to restore the barrier between me and whatever waited outside in the darkness. But I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my hands trembled as I gripped the counter's edge. Through the gap in the door, I could see a slice of the parking lot illuminated by the store's exterior lights. The lot appeared empty, just as it had been all night, but there was something wrong with the shadows. They were too deep, too dark, and they seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. A child's laughter drifted through the open door, high and musical. It echoed across the empty parking lot and seemed to bounce off the surrounding trees before fading into the night. The sound was innocent enough, the kind of giggle you might hear at a playground during the day, but hearing it at nearly 3 a.m. in this desolate place transformed it into something deeply unsettling. The laughter came again, closer this time, and I realized with dawning horror that it was moving. Whatever was making that sound was circling the building, staying just beyond the reach of the exterior lights. I could track its progress by the echoes, first from the front of the store, then the right side, then the back, then the left, completing a full circuit before starting again. I forced myself to look at the security monitors, remembering that I could safely view them now that it was past 3 a.m. What I saw on the screens made me question my sanity. The camera showed the store exactly as it appeared to my eyes. Empty aisles, fluorescent lighting, the slightly open front door. But they also showed something else, something that shouldn't have been possible. In the parking lot camera feed, I could see my own face pressed against the front windows from outside, staring into the store with wide, terrified eyes. But I was standing inside, behind the counter, The me on the screen was wearing the same red polo shirt and khakis, had the same shoulder-length black hair, even had the same small scar above my left eyebrow that I'd gotten falling off my bike when I was 12. The other Sarah raised her hand and pressed it against the glass, her mouth moving as if she were trying to say something. I watched in fascination and horror as she began writing backwards letters on the window with her finger. Backwards because she was writing from the outside, but I could read the message clearly from my position inside. Don't trust the rules. I blinked hard, convinced I was hallucinating, but when I opened my eyes, the other Sarah was gone. The parking lot camera showed nothing but empty asphalt and the dark line of trees beyond. I looked toward the actual front windows, and they were clean, no handprints, no messages, no evidence that anyone had ever been there. The child's laughter had stopped during my fixation on the security monitors, replaced by a new sound that was somehow even worse. The slow drag of footsteps across gravel, accompanied by what sounded like something heavy being pulled behind them. The sounds were coming from the back of the building, near the loading dock where deliveries were made during the day. I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. Time for another freezer temperature check. The very thought of walking to the back of the store filled me with dread, but the rules were clear, and I had already seen what happened when I deviated from them, even slightly. The radio had gone silent when I touched it. The door had opened on its own, and now there were things circling the building in the darkness. Armed with my flashlight and a determination born of desperation, I made my way toward the rear of the store. The fluorescent lights in the storage room flickered more frequently now, creating a strobe effect that made everything appear to move in jerky, unnatural motions. Boxes seemed to shift when the lights dimmed. Shadows stretched and contracted like living things. I could swear I heard whispers coming from between the shelves. The freezer temperature gauge read 2 degrees below zero. According to the rules, this meant I should leave the store immediately. But leave to go where? My car was parked right outside. But after seeing whatever was circling the building and hearing those dragging footsteps, the idea of stepping into the darkness seemed like a death sentence. At least inside the store, I had light and walls and the illusion of safety. As I stood there debating my options, the temperature dropped another degree, then another. The needle on the gauge was falling steadily, and with each degree, the whispers in the storage room grew louder and more distinct. They were speaking my name now, over and over, in voices that ranged from the high pitch of a child to the gravelly rasp of someone very old. Sarah, Sarah, Sarah. The chanting was coming from inside the freezer itself. I pressed my ear against the heavy metal door and could hear them clearly now. Dozens of voices, all calling my name in unison. Men, women, children, all trapped inside that frozen space, all wanting something from me. I stumbled backward, knocking over a case of canned goods in my haste to get away. The cans scattered across the floor with a tremendous crash that seemed to echo through the entire building. In the sudden silence that followed, I realized that the whispers had stopped. Everything had stopped. The fluorescent lights hung steady and still. The hum of the refrigeration units had ceased. Even the ever-present static from the radio in the front of the store had vanished. The only sound in the entire building was my own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of my heart. Then, from somewhere deep in the building, came the sound of a door slowly creaking open. Not the front door this time, but something else. Something inside the store. I crept back toward the main area, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as my hand shook. The sound was coming from the employee break room, a small space behind the counter that contained a table, a few chairs, and a door marked basement, authorized personnel only. The basement door, which I had never seen opened in my 3 months of employment, stood wide open. A set of wooden stairs descended into absolute darkness, and from that darkness came a smell that made my stomach lurch. The overwhelming stench of decay and something else, something chemical and sharp like industrial bleener mixed with copper. But the worst part wasn't the smell or the darkness or even the fact that the door had opened by itself. The worst part was the sound of something climbing those stairs. Slow, labored footsteps echoed up from the depths, accompanied by a wet, sliding noise, as if whatever was climbing was leaving a trail behind it. With each step, the smell grew stronger, and I could hear what sounded like liquid dripping onto the wooden stairs. I backed away from the break room, my mind racing through my options. The front door was still slightly ajar, but going outside meant facing whatever was circling the building. The back exit was near the loading dock, where I'd heard those dragging sounds. The basement was clearly not an option. That left only one choice: hide and hope that whatever was coming up those stairs would pass me by. I ducked behind the counter, crouching low and trying to control my breathing. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, paused for a moment, and then began moving across the break room floor toward the main store area. Each step was accompanied by that horrible, wet, sliding sound. And now I could hear something else, a low, rhythmic sound like someone trying to breathe through damaged lungs. The footsteps entered the main store area, and I pressed myself lower behind the counter, praying that whoever or whatever it was wouldn't think to look back here. But as the sounds grew closer, I realized that hiding was pointless. Whatever was in the store with me knew exactly where I was. "Sarah," it whispered, and the voice was like broken glass scraping against concrete. "Sarah, come out. It's time to follow the real rules." The footsteps stopped directly in front of the counter. I could see a shadow falling across the floor, impossibly tall and distorted. In the reflection of the security monitor screens, I caught a glimpse of what was standing above me, and the image burned itself into my mind like a brand. It had once been human. That much was clear from its general shape and posture. But whatever it was now had been changed by something terrible. Its skin hung in tatters, revealing glimpses of bone and muscle beneath. Its face was a ruin of melted flesh and exposed teeth, and its eyes were completely white, like those of a corpse. But the most horrifying detail was its hands. Where fingers should have been, there were instead long, sharp implements that looked like they had been surgically attached. Knives, screwdrivers, scissors, all fused to the bones of its fingers. When it moved, these metal implements scraped against each other, creating the horrible sound I'd been hearing. "The rules you've been following," it continued in that broken glass voice, "are just the beginning. There are older rules, deeper rules, rules written in blood and bone and carved into the very foundation of this place. Would you like to learn them, Sarah?" I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but huddle behind the counter and hope that this nightmare would end. But deep down, I knew it was just beginning. Whatever this thing was, whatever had happened to create it, it wanted something from me. And I had the terrible feeling that my shift at Maple Hollow General Store was going to last much longer than 8 hours. The creature stood there for what felt like an eternity, its metal-tipped fingers occasionally scraping against each other in a rhythm that almost sounded musical. I remained crouched behind the counter, my muscles cramping from the awkward position, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. The stench of decay and chemicals was overwhelming now, making my eyes water and my throat burn. "I can smell your fear, Sarah," it whispered, and I heard those terrible fingers tap against the countertop above me. Sweet and sharp, like copper pennies and vanilla. It's been so long since we've had someone new to teach. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay hidden, I found my voice. "What do you want?" The tapping stopped. Ah, there she is. The brave little cashier who thought she could work here without understanding the true nature of this place. The creature's breathing was labored, wet, like speaking through a throat full of blood. "What I want is to show you the real rules. The ones that matter. The ones that will keep you alive if you're worthy." Slowly, shakily, I raised my head above the counter. The creature was even more horrifying up close than it had been in the monitor's reflection. Its skin wasn't just hanging in tatters. It was actively decomposing, with patches of green and black spreading across what had once been human flesh. Maggots writhed in the deeper wounds, and a constant stream of some dark fluid dripped from its ruined mouth onto the floor. But its eyes, those milky white orbs, seemed to see everything. They tracked my movement as I stood up, and when they locked onto mine, I felt a cold presence invade my mind, sifting through my thoughts and memories like fingers through sand. "Saracen," it said, and my name sounded obscene when spoken by that ruined mouth. 23 years old, bachelor's degree in English literature, $67,000 in student debt, parents dead in a car accident when you were 19, no siblings, no close friends, no one who would miss you if you simply disappeared. Each fact it recited felt like a violation, and I realized it wasn't just reading my thoughts. It was reading my entire life, every moment of joy and sorrow, every fear and dream, laid bare before this abomination. "How do you know all that?" I whispered. "This place has ways of learning about those who enter its domain." The creature replied, dragging one of its blade fingers across the counter, leaving a deep gouge in the formica surface. "Mrs. Abernathy didn't tell you the whole truth about this job, did she? About what really happens during the night shift?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice. The creature let out what might have been laughter, a sound like breaking glass mixed with a death rattle. "She never does. Follow the rules and you'll be fine," she says. But she never mentions that the rules are designed to select the worthy from the weak. A test, you might call it. A test for what? For joining us, of course. The creature gestured with its mutilated hands toward the basement door, which still stood open, exhaling that awful stench. Every night shift worker who has ever lasted until dawn becomes part of Maple Hollow's true purpose. We're the guardians, Sarah, the protectors, the ones who keep the real horrors at bay. I stared at the creature in disbelief. "You're supposed to be protecting people? You look like something out of a nightmare." "Because we are nightmares," it replied matter-of-factly. "We became nightmares so that others wouldn't have to. The things that lurk in the deep woods around this town, the entities that slip through the cracks in reality when the moon is dark, the ancient hungers that predate human civilization, they all converge here, drawn by something buried beneath this store. We stand guard against them, night after night, year after year." The creature began walking around the counter, its footsteps leaving wet, dark prints on the linoleum floor. "The rules aren't arbitrary, Sarah. Each one serves a purpose. No customers after midnight, because that's when the real things come hunting. Keep the radio on 97.3 because it broadcasts a frequency that masks our activities from certain listeners. Never turn off the lights in the storage room because darkness is a doorway and some doors should never be opened. Don't look at the security cameras between 2 and 3 because that's when we patrol the perimeters and human minds aren't designed to process our true forms. As it spoke, pieces began falling into place. The wet footprints I'd seen earlier, those had been from this creature and others like it as they made their rounds. The sounds in the storage room, the scratching in the ceiling, the things I'd glimpsed on the security monitors, all evidence of a hidden battle being fought while I stood oblivious behind the counter. And the freezer temperature? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. When it drops below 0, it means something has breached our defenses. Something has gotten inside. The creature's white eyes fixed on mine. That's when ordinary humans are supposed to flee, because what comes next isn't meant for civilian eyes. As if summoned by its words, a new sound echoed through the store, a low, thrumming howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The fluorescent lights began flickering rapidly, and several of the security monitors went to static. The creature's head snapped toward the front of the store, its destroyed features twisting into what might have been concern. "Speak of the devil," it muttered, the metal implements that served as its fingers extending like claws. "It seems our conversation has attracted attention." The howl came again, closer now, and with it came a sound like massive claws scraping against concrete. Through the slightly open front door, I could see something moving in the parking lot. Something huge and dark that seemed to absorb the light from the exterior lamps rather than reflect it. "What is that?" I whispered. "A shadow weaver," the creature replied, moving toward the front of the store with surprising speed. "One of the old things, from before humans learned to make fire. They hunt by consuming light, hope, and eventually souls." It turned back to me, and for the first time, I thought I detected something almost human in its ruined face. "This is your final test, Sarah. You can run. The back door is unlocked, and you might make it to your car before it notices you. Or you can stay and learn what it really means to follow the rules." "What happens if I stay?" "If you survive the night, you become like us. Changed, yes. No longer fully human, yes. But you also become something that can stand against the darkness. Something that can protect the innocent." The creature gestured toward the basement door. "Down there, in the deep places beneath this store, are weapons and tools forged for fighting things that shouldn't exist. Become one of us, and you'll never again feel helpless in the face of the unknown." The shadow weaver chose that moment to test the front door, pressing against it with what looked like a massive clawed appendage. The door held, but I could see cracks spreading through the reinforced glass. It wouldn't hold for long, and if I run, then you live a normal life, assuming you survive the next few minutes. But you'll always know that things like this exist, that there are horrors in the world beyond human understanding, and that you chose to leave others to face them alone. The decision should have been easy. Any rational person would have bolted for the back door and never looked back. But as I stood there, watching this creature that had once been human prepare to defend a convenience store against something out of cosmic horror, I thought about my empty apartment, my student debt, my complete lack of purpose or direction in life. The other night shift workers, I said, they all chose to stay. Most of them. A few ran, and we made sure they forgot what they'd seen. But most chose to stay and fight. The creature's voice softened slightly. "We were all like you once, Sarah. Lost, alone, looking for something to give our lives meaning. Here, In this terrible place, we found it. The shadow weaver struck the door again, and this time the glass shattered completely. Cold air rushed into the store, carrying with it the smell of earth and old graves, and something else, something like ozone and burnt copper. Through the ruined doorway, I could see glimpses of the thing that had been trying to get in. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall and proportionally wide, but its shape seemed to shift and flow like living shadow. Where it touched the ground, the asphalt began to blacken and crack. The exterior lights flickered and died one by one as it approached, and I realized that it wasn't just consuming light. It was consuming reality itself, leaving nothing but void in its wake. "Choose now, Sarah," the creature said, its blade fingers extending to their full length. "Fight or flight. There's no shame in either choice, but there's no time for indecision." I looked at the shadow weaver, at the creature that had once been human, at the basement door leading to weapons I couldn't imagine. I thought about Mrs. Abernathy and her cryptic warnings, about Jenny's desperate urgency as she'd left me alone on my first night, about all the missing people mentioned in that strange radio broadcast. They hadn't disappeared. They had chosen to stay and fight. What do I need to do? I asked. The creature smiled, and despite its ruined features, there was something almost proud in that expression. "First rule of the real job," it said, moving toward the basement door. "When the monsters come calling, we answer with monsters of our own." As we descended into the darkness beneath Maple Hollow General Store, I could hear the shadow weaver entering the building behind us, its passage marked by the sound of everything it touched crumbling to dust. But for the first time since my shift began, I wasn't afraid. I was something else entirely. I was angry. And according to my new companion, anger was exactly what I would need for what came next. The basement beneath Maple Hollow General Store was nothing like what I had expected. Instead of a cramped storage space filled with dusty boxes and forgotten merchandise, I found myself in a vast underground chamber that seemed to extend far beyond the footprint of the building above. The walls were carved from solid granite and covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, writhing geometric patterns that seemed to move and shift when caught in my peripheral vision. Emergency lighting strips ran along the walls, casting everything in a dim red glow that made the shadows dance like living things. The air was thick with the smell of old stone and something else, something metallic and sharp that reminded me of blood and electricity mixed together. "Welcome to the real Maple Hollow General Store," the creature said, its blade fingers clicking against the stone walls as we descended deeper. "This is where the actual work happens." The basement was divided into several sections, each serving a different purpose. We passed what looked like a medical bay equipped with instruments I couldn't identify, their surfaces gleaming with an oily, rainbow sheen. Further on was an armory lined with weapons that definitely hadn't been made by human hands, blades that seemed to be forged from crystallized shadow, firearms that pulsed with their own internal light, and stranger things still that I couldn't even begin to categorize. But it was the central chamber that took my breath away. Carved into the floor was an enormous pentagram, easily 20 feet across, with lines of what looked like molten silver flowing through the grooves. At each point of the star stood a pillar topped with a different symbol, and from each pillar, cables and wires led to a massive console that looked like it belonged on a spacecraft rather than in a basement in Vermont. "What is this place?" I whispered. "A monitoring station," the creature explained, moving to the console and beginning to flip switches with surprising dexterity given its mutilated hands. The pentagram acts as a focal point for tracking supernatural activity across a 100-mile radius. The pillars are anchor points for various protective wards. And this. It gestured to the console with something approaching pride. This is how we coordinate our defenses against things that want to end the world. The console came alive with a symphony of beeps, clicks, and electronic chirps. Dozens of screens flickered on, showing feed from cameras I hadn't known existed, not just in the store above, but throughout the surrounding forest, in other buildings around town, even in places that looked like they might be underground caverns or abandoned mines. On one screen, I could see the shadow weaver moving through the store above us, its passage leaving trails of decay and corruption. Wherever it stepped, the floor began to rot, and the air itself seemed to darken and thicken. It was searching for something, moving with purpose rather than random destruction. "It's looking for us," I said. "No," the creature replied, studying the readings on various monitors. "It's looking for the entrance to this place. Shadow weavers are drawn to concentrated sources of psychic energy, and this chamber puts out a signature that's visible from dimensions away." It turned to look at me with those horrible white eyes. "Which is why we need to complete your transformation quickly. An untransformed human in this chamber is like a beacon to things like that." Transformation. The word came out as barely a whisper. Did you think you could fight cosmic horrors with nothing but human flesh and determination? The creature moved to a section of the chamber I hadn't noticed before. A raised platform surrounded by more of those painful-to-look-at symbols, with what appeared to be an operating table at its center. The process isn't pleasant, but it's necessary. You'll retain your memories, your personality, your essential self, but your body will become something capable of standing against the darkness. I stared at the operating table, my mind reeling. What exactly happens to me? That depends on you, the creature said. The transformation adapts itself to the individual. Some become like me, enhance strength, resilience, and natural weapons. Others develop different abilities. Marcus, who works the Tuesday night shift, can phase in and out of solid matter. Elena, Thursdays, can see across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The process takes what you are and makes it into what you need to be. Above us, a tremendous crash shook the entire building. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and several of the monitors flickered. On the screen showing the store, I could see that the Shadow Weaver had grown impatient with its search and was now actively destroying everything in its path. Shelves collapsed, the refrigeration units sparked and died, and the very structure of the building groaned under the creature's assault. "We're running out of time," the creature said urgently. "The building's protective wards will hold for maybe another 10 minutes before that thing punches through to the basement level. After that," it gestured helplessly with its blade fingers. "What happens if I don't transform?" I asked. "Then you die when a Shadow Weaver finds us. And probably everyone else in Maple Hollow dies shortly after, because we'll be down one guardian, and that thing will be free to summon its pack." The creature moved to the operating table and began preparing various instruments that looked like they belonged in both a surgical suite and a medieval torture chamber. "The choice is yours, Sarah, but make it quickly." I looked around the chamber one more time, at the advanced technology, at the mystical symbols, at the evidence of an ongoing war between humanity and forces beyond our understanding. Then I looked at the screens showing the destruction above, at the creature that had once been human preparing to help me become something more than human, at the terrible beauty of a place designed to hold back the dark. "Will it hurt?" I asked. "Yes," the creature replied honestly. "It will hurt more than anything you've ever experienced. But the pain is temporary. What comes after? What comes after is purpose." I climbed onto the operating table, my hands shaking, but my resolve firm. The creature began attaching cables and sensors to my body, its touch surprisingly gentle despite those horrible blade fingers. As each connection was made, I could feel something stirring in my mind, a vast presence that seemed to be evaluating me, measuring my worth, determining what I would become. My name was David, the creature said as it worked. "David Martinez. I was a night shift worker here 6 years ago. Before that, I was a grad student at UVM, studying folklore and mythology. Thought I was so smart, thought I understood how the world worked." It paused in its preparations, and for a moment, I could see the human being it had once been shining through its ruined features. I chose to become this because I realized that knowledge without the power to act on it is useless. Now I can protect people from things they'll never even know existed. "Do you regret it?" I asked. David considered the question seriously. "There are days when I miss being human, miss the taste of food, the feel of sunlight on skin, the simple pleasure of a good book. But then I think about how many people are alive today because I made this choice and no, I don't regret it." The final connection was made, and immediately I felt power coursing through my body. Not pleasant power, but something raw and dangerous that made my bones ache and my blood feel like it was on fire. The symbols carved into the platform began to glow with that same painful light, and the chamber filled with a sound like reality tearing. "The transformation responds to who you are at your core," David said, his voice seeming to come from very far away. "Don't fight it. Let it show you what you're meant to become." Pain exploded through every nerve in my body as the power took hold. I felt my bones lengthening, my muscles rewriting themselves, my very DNA being rewritten by forces beyond human science. But worse than the physical agony was the mental transformation. I could feel my perception expanding, my awareness stretching out to encompass things that no human mind was designed to process. I could sense the shadow weaver above us, could feel its alien hunger and its consuming hatred for all things that existed in the light. But I could also sense other things. The network of guardians spread throughout this part of Vermont, each one a bright point of determined resistance against the dark. I could feel the ancient thing buried deep beneath the store, the source of all the supernatural activity in the area, sleeping fitfully in chains that had been forged by the first human inhabitants of this land. And I could feel myself changing, becoming something that could stand against these forces. The pain reached a crescendo and then suddenly stopped. I opened eyes that I somehow knew were no longer entirely human and looked down at my hands. My skin had taken on a faint luminescence, as if lit from within by some internal fire. When I flexed my fingers, tendrils of that same light danced between them, and I instinctively understood that I could shape that light into weapons, shields, or tools as needed. "A light bringer," David said, and there was genuine awe in his ruined voice. "I haven't seen one of those in decades. You'll be able to harm creatures that exist partially outside our dimension, things that normal weapons can't even touch." I sat up on the operating table, marveling at how different my body felt. I was stronger, faster, more aware of my surroundings than I had ever been as a purely human being. But more than that, I could sense the rightness of what I had become. This was what I was meant to be, what I had always been meant to be. "How do you feel?" David asked. "Complete," I replied, and realized it was true. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Another crash from above reminded us that our moment of wonder would have to wait. The Shadow Weaver was getting closer to finding the basement entrance, and now that my transformation was complete, I could sense its hunger more clearly than ever. It wasn't just seeking to destroy, it was seeking to consume, to add our life force to its own dark power. "Ready for your first shift as a real guardian?" David asked, moving to the armory and selecting weapons suitable for our opponent. I stood up from the operating table, light dancing around my transformed hands, and felt a smile cross my face that would have terrified my former human self. "Let's go protect some people." As we prepared for battle, I couldn't help but think about how different my life had become in the span of a single night. I had arrived at Maple Hollow General Store as a lost college graduate with no direction and no purpose. Now I was something else entirely, a guardian, a protector, a being capable of standing against the darkness that most people never even suspected existed. The rules had indeed kept me alive. But more than that, they had shown me who I really was. Armed with weapons forged from crystallized starlight and my newfound abilities, David and I ascended from the underground chamber to face the Shadow Weaver. The store above had been transformed into a battlefield. Shelves lay toppled, merchandise scattered like shrapnel, and the very air seemed thick with malevolent energy. The creature had grown larger since entering the building, feeding off the destruction it caused, and now it nearly filled the space between floor and ceiling. When it sensed our approach, the Shadow Weaver turned toward us with movements that defied physics. Its form rippled and flowed like liquid darkness, and where its attention focused, reality itself seemed to bend and warp. Up close, I could see that it wasn't entirely solid. Stars and galaxies swirled within its body, as if it contained entire universes of dark matter. So, it spoke without a mouth, its voice resonating directly in our minds. "The store has birthed another guardian. How delightfully predictable. And you've made the same mistake every Shadow Weaver makes," David replied, extending his blade fingers to their full length. "You assumed we'd be easy prey." The creature's laughter was like the sound of dying solar systems. "I have consumed the light of 1,000 worlds, devoured the dreams of species you cannot imagine. We're two transformed humans against such power." I stepped forward, light coiling around my hands like living ribbons. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't afraid. The transformation had burned away my fear and replaced it with something far more powerful: purpose. "We're the people who chose to stand between you and everyone else," I said, and my voice carried harmonics that hadn't been there when I was human. "We're the ones who said no to the dark." The Shadow Weaver struck without warning, lashing out with tendrils of pure void that moved faster than thought. David threw himself sideways, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to barely avoid being touched by the creature's essence. Where the tendrils passed, they left trails of nothingness. Not darkness, but actual absence, as if pieces of reality had been surgically removed. I raised my hands instinctively, and light poured from them in a torrential flood. The radiance struck the Shadow Weaver and elicited a shriek that shattered what remained of the store's windows. For a moment, the creature's form wavered and became less solid, and I realized that my light wasn't just illumination. It was existence itself, the fundamental force that gave meaning to matter and energy. Impossible, the Shadow Weaver hissed, recoiling from my attack. Lightbringers were extinct. We made sure of that during the last convergence. Apparently you missed one, David said, pressing his own attack. His blade fingers had extended into full swords now, each one gleaming with the same oily, rainbow sheen I had seen on the medical instruments below. When they struck the Shadow Weaver, they actually cut into its substance, causing it to bleed darkness that evaporated before hitting the floor. But the creature was far from defeated. It had been feeding on destruction for hours now, growing stronger with each bit of reality it consumed. It lashed out again, this time with multiple tendrils simultaneously, forcing David and me to separate as we dodged its attacks. "You cannot win," it snarled, its form beginning to shift and expand. "Even if you destroy this manifestation, there are others. The convergence has already begun. In 7 nights, when the barrier between dimensions grows thin, my masters will break through in force. Your little network of guardians will be swept aside like dust before a hurricane. Then we'll make sure that doesn't happen," I said, pouring more power into my light. But I could feel the strain already. My newly transformed body was powerful, but I was still learning how to use these abilities. The Shadow Weaver, on the other hand, had been perfecting the art of destruction for eons. The creature seemed to sense my growing fatigue. It pressed its attack more aggressively, forcing David to intervene repeatedly to keep me from being overwhelmed. His blade fingers moved like liquid metal, cutting and slashing at the Shadow Weaver's essence. But for every wound he inflicted, the creature seemed to heal 2 more. "The basement," David shouted over the sound of our battle. "We need to get into the containment chamber. Up here, it can draw power from the dimensional barriers. Down there, the wards will contain its abilities. How do we get to follow us?" I asked, unleashing another wave of light that forced the Shadow Weaver to temporarily retreat. "We make it angry," David replied, and I could hear the grin in his voice despite the horror of his transformed features. Shadow Weavers are proud creatures. They hate being outmaneuvered by beings they consider inferior. He was right. I could sense the creature's growing frustration as we continued to evade its attacks. It had expected easy prey, not a coordinated defense from beings who understood its nature and capabilities. "You want to know the truth about your precious store?" The Shadow Weaver snarled, its form beginning to pulse with darker energy. It was built on a convergence point, a place where multiple dimensions intersect. The thing sleeping beneath your feet isn't some ancient evil you're guarding against. It's the anchor point for a dimensional seal, and every night you spend here weakens it a little more. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. We weren't just guarding against monsters. We were part of a larger process, one that was slowly but inevitably leading to the very catastrophe we thought we were preventing. The transformations, the guardians, the entire network, the Shadow Weaver continued, pressing its psychological advantage. All of it designed to channel psychic energy into that seal, to keep it stable for as long as possible. But it was always meant to fail eventually. Your Mrs. Abernathy isn't trying to save the world. She's buying it time. David's expression had gone grim. Even if that's true, time is still valuable. Every night we hold the line is another night for humanity to grow stronger to develop better defenses, to prepare for what's coming. And what if humanity isn't meant to survive what's coming? The Shadow Weaver asked. What if the convergence is part of a natural cycle, the universe's way of clearing away old life to make room for new? Then we'll prove the universe wrong, I said, and meant it. The light around my hands had changed, becoming more focused, more intense. I was learning to channel not just illumination, but something deeper, the fundamental force that said existence in the face of void. The Shadow Weaver sensed the change in my power and attacked with renewed fury. This time, instead of dodging, I stood my ground and met its assault head-on. Light and darkness clashed in the center of the ruined store, creating a maelstrom of competing forces that made the air itself scream. For a moment, we were perfectly balanced, creation and destruction, existence and void, hope and despair locked in eternal struggle. But then I felt something shift inside me, some final transformation taking place at the deepest level of my being. I wasn't just fighting for humanity, or for the world, or even for the continuation of reality itself. I was fighting for the simple right of things to exist, to matter, to have meaning in an uncaring universe. And that, I realized, was a power that no amount of cosmic destruction could overcome. Light erupted from me in a wave that encompassed the entire store. Not the harsh, artificial illumination of fluorescent bulbs, but the warm, golden radiance of creation itself. It washed over the Shadow Weaver like a tsunami of pure existence. And for the first time since the battle began, the creature screamed in genuine pain. Its form began to unravel, the darkness that composed its body becoming less solid, less real. The stars and galaxies swirling within it guttered and died like candle flames in a hurricane. "This isn't possible," it whispered as it faded. "The light, it's not just destroying me. It's making me never have existed in the first place." "That's the thing about light bringers," David said, moving to stand beside me as we watched the Shadow Weaver dissolve. "We don't just fight the darkness. We remake reality so that the darkness was never there to begin with." As the creature faded completely, taking with it all traces of the damage it had caused, I felt a profound sense of completion wash over me. The store began to reassemble itself around us, shelves righting themselves, merchandise returning to its proper places, even the shattered windows healing as if they had never been broken. "Is it over?" I asked. "This attack is over," David replied. "But there will be others. 7 nights from now, if the Shadow Weaver was telling the truth, we'll face something much worse." He looked at me with those horrible, wonderful white eyes. "Think you're ready for a career change?" I looked around the restored store, at the fluorescent lights humming peacefully overhead, at the radio playing classic rock on station 97.3, at the security monitors showing nothing but empty parking lot and peaceful forest. In a few hours, the sun would rise, and Mrs. Abernathy would arrive to open for the day's shift. Normal people would come in to buy coffee and newspapers, completely unaware of the battle that had just been fought for their continued existence. "You know what?" I said, moving behind the counter to straighten the cash register and check the coffee machines. "I think I'm going to like working here." David laughed. Actually laughed, a sound that was surprisingly human despite his transformed vocal cords. "Welcome to the real night shift, Sarah. Try not to let it go to your head." As he disappeared back into the basement to file his report and prepare for the next threat, I settled in behind the counter for the remaining hours of my shift. The rules were still posted on their laminated sheet, and I read them one more time with new understanding. No customers after midnight, because that's when the Guardians worked. Keep the radio on station 97.3, because it masked the sounds of battle. Never turn off the fluorescent lights in the storage room, because darkness was always a doorway. Don't look directly at the security cameras between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., because some truths were too terrible for untransformed minds. Check the freezer temperature every hour, and if it drops below 0 degrees, leave the store immediately, because that meant something had gotten through the defenses. But now I understood there was a sixth rule, unwritten but more important than all the others. When the darkness comes calling, we answer with light. Always with light. At 6 a.m. sharp, Mrs. Abernathy arrived to relieve me. She took one look at my transformed appearance, the faint luminescence of my skin, the new awareness in my eyes, the way light seemed to bend around me, and smiled. "How was your first real night?" she asked. "Educational," I replied. "When do I start training for the convergence?" "Tomorrow night," she said, settling in behind the counter with the ease of long practice. "David will begin teaching you advanced combat techniques, and you'll start coordinating with the other Guardians in the network. It's going to be a busy week." I nodded and gathered my things, preparing to leave. But as I reached the door, Mrs. Abernathy called out to me one last time. "Sarah, thank you for choosing to stay. Not everyone does." "Thank you for giving me the choice," I replied. I walked out into the dawn light, no longer the lost college graduate who had walked in 12 hours earlier. I was something new, something necessary, something that stood between the world and the dark. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was meant to be. Behind me, Maple Hollow General Store settled into its daytime routine, giving no indication of the cosmic battles fought within its walls each night. But that was as it should be. Some truths were too terrible for most people to bear, but some of us were built to bear them. Some of us were built to stand guard while the world slept, to fight the battles that couldn't be fought in daylight, to follow rules that kept everyone alive. Some of us were built to be the night shift, and I couldn't wait to get back to work.